You manage everything. The schedule, the expectations, the mood in the room before anyone else notices it shifting. From the outside, your life looks composed, maybe even admirable. You meet deadlines, you show up, you say yes when you mean no, and somehow that has become the architecture of your daily existence. You are not failing. You are not falling apart. There is no visible crisis, and yet there is something you carry that doesn't have a clean name. A quiet exhaustion that arrives not from doing too much, but from being too careful, too watchful, too afraid of the moment someone looks at you and feels let down. You have been living your life around that moment, and you may not have noticed until just now. There is a type of person who seems, on the surface, remarkably easy to be around. They adapt, they accommodate, they have an unusual sensitivity to the needs of others. Reading rooms, adjusting tone, softening edges before conflict has a chance to form. People feel comfortable around them. Sometimes they feel understood by them in ways they can't quite articulate. And this person receives that warmth, holds it carefully, and quietly uses it as evidence that they are doing enough, being enough, that the invisible work is paying off. But the invisible work never stops. What most people don't see is that this accommodating, attuned, quietly generous person is also scanning constantly. Not for danger in the dramatic sense, for something subtler. They are scanning for the first flicker of disappointment on someone else's face. A pause before a response, a tone that dropped half a degree, a silence that lasted 2 seconds longer than it should have. And when they find it, or think they find it, something shifts inside them that is hard to describe, but very hard to ignore. Psychologists who study emotional conditioning would recognize this immediately. It is not anxiety in the way people usually think of anxiety. It is more like a finely tuned alarm system built around one specific signal, the signal that someone somewhere is not satisfied. To understand where this comes from, you have to go backward, not to one dramatic moment, but to a long, slow pattern, the kind that forms before a child has the language to name what is happening to them. Some children learn early that love is conditional, not through cruelty, but through attunement, through the subtle discovery that warmth increases when they perform well, when they don't cause trouble, when they make it easy. The parent who lights up at achievement, the adult whose mood the child learns to monitor before they've learned to read, the household where peace was something you maintained by shrinking your needs just enough. Attachment researchers have long observed that when a child's emotional safety depends on managing the emotional state of the caregiver, something fundamental shifts in how that child understands their own worth. Worth becomes something earned through behavior rather than something simply held. And that belief, quiet, pre-verbal, bone deep, follows a person into adulthood without an invitation. This isn't about blame. The people who shape this pattern often love deeply, but love delivered through approval rather than presence teaches a child a very specific equation. I am good when I make others comfortable. I am at risk when I do not. And so a person grows up. They become competent, often impressively so. They learn to anticipate. They learn to give before being asked. They become the person others describe as thoughtful, dependable, the one who always comes through. And for a long time this works. The approval keeps arriving. The relationships feel stable. The alarm system rarely fires because they've engineered their life well enough to keep disappointment at bay. But here is where the paradox lives. The more skilled they become at avoiding disappointment, the more they need to avoid it. because every year that passes without a major rupture becomes evidence. Not that they are loved unconditionally, but that the strategy is working, that the accommodation is what's holding everything together, that if they stopped, if they said no once, if they let someone down even gently, something irreversible might happen. The fear doesn't diminish with success, it scales with it. Winnicott wrote about the false self, the personality that forms not from authentic expression, but from adaptation to the environment. Not a mask exactly, something more intricate, a self that genuinely believes its own performance, that has rehearsed its accommodations so long they no longer feel like accommodations at all. They feel like character, they feel like who you are. And that is the quiet tragedy of it. It isn't performed for others, it is lived from the inside. There is something neurological happening here that makes the pattern stubborn in a way that willpower alone cannot address. The anticipation of social disapproval activates threat circuitry in the brain. Research in social neuroscience suggests that rejection and exclusion register in some of the same neural regions as physical pain. The fear of disappointing someone isn't irrational hypersensitivity. It is the nervous system doing what it was trained to do, treating relational safety as survival. And so, the behavior that looks from the outside like excessive niceness or people-pleasing or conflict avoidance is, from the inside, a nervous system doing its job, protecting what feels most fragile, keeping the connection intact. Because somewhere in the layered architecture of the psyche, disconnection still feels like a threat that must be prevented at almost any cost. This is why logic doesn't dissolve it. You can know intellectually that one honest conversation will not destroy a relationship and still feel the resistance rise before you say anything real. You can understand rationally that your worth is not contingent on someone else's satisfaction and still feel the floor shift beneath you when someone seems even slightly displeased. Knowing and feeling are not the same country. The shadow side of this pattern is rarely discussed because the person living it rarely brings it up. They are, after all, very good at seeming fine. But inside the life of someone who lives to avoid disappointing others, there is often a quiet resentment that has nowhere to go. Not the sharp, visible kind, something more diffuse, a low-grade awareness that they have been saying yes for a very long time and that no one has asked them recently what they actually want. They don't name this resentment, they reroute it into efficiency, into humour, into being even more helpful, into a private kind of exhaustion they don't consider worth mentioning. Because mentioning it would mean acknowledging the cost, and acknowledging the cost would mean acknowledging the choice. And somewhere in that, acknowledgement is a question they have been avoiding for years. Was it ever really a choice? Jung described the shadow as everything we refuse to integrate, not just the dark, but the unlived. For someone whose identity is organized around being easy, around being the one who doesn't cause trouble, the shadow often holds everything they genuinely want but have never permitted themselves to fully claim. A boundary, a preference, a no. The expression of something that might not be received warmly, not because they are afraid of the feeling, but because they are afraid of what happens after. There is also a deep, private loneliness in this pattern that almost no one talks about. When your relationships are built on your capacity to accommodate, you can never be entirely sure which ones would survive your authenticity. This is not a paranoid thought. It is a quiet, reasonable concern that forms from experience, because these people have seen often that when they do express something true, a real need, a real limit, the response is sometimes surprise, sometimes discomfort, occasionally withdrawal, and each of those moments confirms something the nervous system already believed, that the real version of you is harder to love. So they keep curating, keep managing the presentation, keep arriving in their relationships as the version of themselves most likely to be received well. And inside that curation, real intimacy becomes difficult. Not impossible, but perpetually just out of reach. Because intimacy requires two people, and one of them is still performing. This is the cost no one counts when they describe this person as so easy to be around. The ease is labor, the warmth is architecture, and the person providing it is often deeply, quietly alone in the middle of rooms full of people who appreciate them. There comes a moment, sometimes in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, sometimes at 3 a.m, when the scaffolding becomes visible. It doesn't announce itself dramatically. It's more like catching your reflection at an unexpected angle, a moment when someone asks what you want, and you realize you have no immediate answer. Or when a relationship ends, and the first thing you feel isn't grief but relief, and that relief frightens you more than the loss did. Or perhaps it's simpler than that. Perhaps it's just the accumulation of years of noticing that your yeses have a different texture than you'd like, that you're tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix, that you have become very good at something you never consciously chose. Psychologists who study identity formation observe that the self is never static. It is always in the process of negotiation between who we were trained to be and who we might, under different conditions, become. The conditioning is real, but it is not the only thing that is real. There is something else present in the person who fears disappointment, something that outlasted all the accommodation, a genuine capacity for care, a deep attunement to others that, when it is freely given rather than fearfully offered, is one of the most valuable things a person can hold. The question is not how to stop caring what others think. That question leads nowhere useful. The question is older and quieter than that. It has been waiting under everything else, patient and unresolved. Whose life exactly have you been protecting?